Era? No, it's just too wide. I'm not sure if I think it's not level. It's not. The camera itself is not level. It's basically like slanted. Good. Simple. Alright, inshallah, we're gonna start in 1 minute, you guys. To grab something. Oh no. I think this thing moved again. All right, sorry guys about that. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. I begin in the name of Almighty Allah. I invoke His peace and blessings upon our beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to extend His blessings to the Prophet's family and his companions, and to all men and women that walk with fortitude in their footsteps, and ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us among them. Allahumma ameen. Brothers and sisters, Jazakumullahu khair. This is the Tafsirah program. Again, it's good to see those of you who are here with us in person and those who are following us on the live broadcast on YouTube. We are still in the shade of Surah Al-Baqarah, and tonight, inshallah, I think is our 27th session. We just finished Ayatul Kursi last time, and inshallah ta'ala we will continue with the rest of the surah. We have probably, I hope, inshallah, 3 more sessions and we'll be done. There's a what? Oh, right here? Well, it says, I think it's still red, so we might still be okay. I hope that we're still connected. Can you guys go on the Tarbiyah YouTube and just make sure that the broadcast is still on? I think so. Sometimes it does that when the Wi-Fi is not very strong. We good? All right. So we've had this lengthy conversation about Surah Al-Baqarah that has now lasted about 1.5 years, since January of 2023. We've been at it. And I think I've repeated the theme of Surah Al-Baqarah so many times in so many different ways that I think it got stuck in our heads, I hope, inshallah, completely. And I said that Surah Al-Baqarah is the constitution of this ummah. It was the defining spirit of the Madani period of the Quran. It continued to come down to be revealed across the 9 years of the Madani period, constantly coming in the background. While other surahs are being revealed, Surah Al-Baqarah continues to come. And I said that in the Madani period, Surah Al-Baqarah comes after Surah Al-Mutaffifin. Al-Mutaffifin was revealed on the Prophet ﷺ while he was doing Hijrah, so it's kind of sort of like the introduction. And Surah Al-Baqarah is chapter 1 in the Madani period. In the Quran, in the collection itself, in the Mus'haf, Surah Al-Baqarah comes after the introduction, which is Surah Al-Fatiha, so technically still makes it chapter 1 in the Quran. And thus, we take the teachings of Surah Al-Baqarah with the utmost seriousness. And I said that the theme of Surah Al-Baqarah is to inspire man to build a godly civilization. A civilization that is inspired by the purposes of the Creator and not the expediency of man. I said that the word I think that we use in Arabic is imaratul ard, causing the earth to thrive or cultivating the earth for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah gives the marching orders and we execute those orders. Allah provides you with the guidelines and we use human creativity and human agency and human resources in order to execute the plan of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it's not angels that will come down on earth and do God's work, it's actual human beings. God sent prophets and messengers, you know, with their limited efforts in order to achieve miracles right here on earth. And I also said before that the selection of the word Al-Baqarah, the cow, to be the title of this surah is quite fitting because it is a reference to a story where man basically refused to do his part, right? So if we say that building a God-centered civilization on earth is a shared responsibility between Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and human beings, then Allah does his part by sending the prophets and the messengers and giving us the instructions, and then we do our part by executing those instructions without making things complicated. Yet in the story, you know, a man is murdered in Bani Israel, and you know, in order for people to verify who the perpetrator was, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically inspired Musa alayhi salam, اذبحوا Baqarah, slaughter a cow, take some of its meat, strike the dead person can come back to life, and testify as to the person who murdered them. It should have ended right then and there, but they kept asking complicated questions. What is the color? What does it look like? What is the size? How do we do this? How do we do that? Made the matter difficult on themselves, and therefore they were punished for it. So the moral of the story is that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala provides you with guidance, and that guidance is necessary for you to live a good, godly life, take those instructions. Don't complicate things on yourself. Do your part, right? Don't wait for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to reveal every single tiny little detail. Don't keep going asking the Imam all the complicated questions. You know the answers. You have the spirit. Start doing, basically. I said that Surah Al-Baqarah is divided into 4 segments or 4 sections, and we are on section 3, almost done with section. In fact, section 4 is just the last 2 ayat of Surah Al-Baqarah, so it's not really that much. But section 3 basically talks about the foundations of Imaratul Ard. And I said that there's 2 foundations of building a God-centric civilization, and that is al-fikru wal-mal, right? Intellect and wealth. Okay? You cannot build a good civilization without having the right set of ideas, and you cannot do that unless you back that up with, power and financial resources, and so on and so forth. And I also said that last time, having the right ideas about God is foundational, as a starting point. What happened, I think, in Europe and the decline in religious commitment and the revolution against the church and basically the loss of religion in general. Europe has become extremely ungodly. It has become, very atheistic, right? That has happened as a result of wrong ideas about God that kind of festered over the years. Initially, when humanity did not have much knowledge in science and technology, kind of accepted those ideas. They were like kind of, but they accepted them. Right? The idea that God is 1 and 3 at the same time, that was not an easy thing to swallow. Yet, Christians, for example, for the longest time, they accepted that idea until obviously, the 1500s and the 1600s, when Galileo and Copernicus, started challenging the church and so forth, and now gradually the Aristotelian worldview that has basically governed the Christian world, and quite honestly, to a certain extent, the Muslim world as well, was abrogated or was kind of dismissed. The idea that everything right here on earth is mundane and dirty and unholy, and everything, in the heavens is celestial and heavenly and beautiful and so forth. Gradually, I think physics taught us that we just live in one universe. Right? And Earth is just one manifestation of that universe. As far as physical laws are concerned, there isn't much difference between here and Copernicus and other galaxies, right? So that notion in and of itself was shot down. And from there, it was a decline of Christianity in Europe. So God that favors a particular ethnic group and elevates that ethnic group above all else, again, that idea turned out to be false over time. And it contributed to people losing faith. And what kind of God would favor a racial group, above other, human beings? I told you last time about the story in the Torah about, God wrestling with Yaqub alayhi salam. In fact, the word Israel, which is the other name for Yaqub, means one who wrestles with God. Okay? So there's literally an assumption that God would physically wrestle with a human being, and to make matters worse, God would actually lose the match, right? These are not only wrong ideas about God, they're bad ideas about God, because they push us away from God. And in order to build a godly civilization, you have to have the right ideas about God in the first place. Okay? A God that sends his human son, of course, why does God have to have a human son in the first place? Remains, a big question. But he sends his human son, to die on the cross for the sins of humanity. Just sounds like a bit of a stretch. Even if we don't say that it was wrong. I mean, we know in Islam that we reject, this doctrine. But for an outsider, even if we don't say that it's wrong, it's just a great stretch that God would really feel compelled to do something like this. God that, created man in his own image, as is often, suggested. But the image of man is very flawed. The image, we have noses with two nostrils and hair inside and a deviated nasal septum, and we snore at night because of that. And there's boogers in our noses. Why would God create man in his own image when we look like this? I mean, alhamdulillah, we look good, we look okay, but it's unimaginable that God would have to have like hair follicles. It's unimaginable that God would need eyebrows. It's unimaginable that God would need, a retina and a pupil and a cornea. It's unimaginable that God needs eardrums, or that God needs a belly button, or God needs a liver, or whatever, right? If God created us in his own image, then God looks like this. And if God looks like this, then it raises a host of questions. Why does God need to look like this? We look like this for a very functional reason, because we need to look like this, right? I need my ear, and need my nose, and I need my eyes. But God does not need any of that. So these are, again, questionable notions about God that prevailed for centuries and ultimately pushed people away from faith. A God that created Adam and Eve and had a plan for them, and then they kind of did something behind his back, and then he comes and he's like, wait a second, you ate from the tree. What is wrong with you? And he gets so angry, and then he kicks them out, as if he had no foreknowledge of this, as if he didn't see it when it was happening, right? Like the way it's described, again, lends itself to a God that was asleep, a God that was kind of like doing something else, that was busy, that was distracted, right? A God that is opposed to science, that approves of colonialism and racism and the occupation of native lands and the transatlantic slave trade and oppression and inquisition. All of these things were done in the name of God. They were all perpetrated in the name of God. And so again, Europe came to a point where those ideas about God were not good. They were not sufficient. They could not accept that God anymore, and that's why people moved away from faith. So the Quran teaches us that at the very foundation of building a God-centric civilization, you have to have the right ideas about God. And I talked at length last time about how the set of ideas that constitute Western civilization have come to prevail in the world today. Doesn't necessarily mean that they are the right type of ideas. They're just ideas that have won the battle. They have not the battle, they've won the round at least, okay? It doesn't mean they are permanent. Certainly doesn't mean that they are correct. So this is what shaped the current intellectual dilemmas of the Western world. And it's imperative for the Quran to set the record straight about God. Hence was the conversation in Ayatul Kursi. Ayatul Kursi teaches you about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It talks about Tawheed. And it talks about Tawheed, monotheism, not from a theological standpoint. It talks about from a very philosophical angle, right? We talked about this last time. The oneness of God and his infinity and so forth. We talked about, causality. We talked about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as this personal God and not a mechanical process that created the universe. We talked about the beginninglessness of God. We talked about the immortality and eternal nature of God. We talked about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as Al-Qayyum, right? He is the establisher of things. He's the causer of things himself, subhanahu wa ta'ala, the power that causes every contingent thing while not necessarily belonging to it. And we went through Ayatul Kursi, one notion after the other, in order again to demonstrate the Quranic narrative on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as a starting point. If we as Muslims are tasked with the establishment of a godly or a God-centric civilization, then we need to start doing this in our own hearts. If you have the wrong ideas about God in your own heart, and I will demonstrate, I will talk to you more about this inshallah ta'ala later in the session tonight, then you will lose your faith. And if you don't have the right set of ideas, you're not able to teach your own kids about God. You're not able to conduct the affairs of your family in a godly manner. And if you can't do that, then you certainly can't do that in the community, you can't do that in society, you can't do that in the world, right? So that's what we covered last time. And tonight, inshallah ta'ala, we're going to move into another ideational paradigm, if you will. And that is, the Quran is also very realistic and very natural when it comes to the human being. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the argument is very, very simple. If God created us a certain way, then it would not make any sense for that same God to then go in and challenge the way that He created us. Okay, so and I need to basically show you exactly what I mean by this. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created man as an inquisitive creature who always tries to ask questions and understand and be convinced and find what's logical and what's rational and what makes sense, this is how we are. If God says that I will endow you with free will, in fact, that is the one thing that distinguished Adam from everyone else, is that Adam was given that free will. That is the gift of man, okay? As opposed to apes or higher primates or reptiles or birds, or even angels. They don't have the free will that we possess. So this is something that matters so much to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and He gave it to us. So it would not make any sense then for God to give you free will and then go around and strip that free will from you. Okay? Hence, what I consider to be not only one of the most essential theological notions in the Quran, I also think it's one of its most intellectually sound paradigms, and that is the paradigm of La ikraha fi ddin. The paradigm of La ikraha fi ddin, there shall be no compulsion in religion. If God gave you the power to decide whether He exists or not, whether you should follow Him or not, whether you should take the moral path or the amoral path, that is up to you. How could God possibly then turn around and say people need to convert by violence and by coercive measures? Okay? It's interesting, again, I use the history of Judaism and the history of Christianity because they're juxtaposed with the history of Islam, and it's very telling and very instructive for us. So if you look at, pre-Constantine Roman Empire, for like almost 350 years, they really got super creative in exacting the absolute most horrific violence against Christians, right? Across the Roman Empire. And then, out of the blue, Constantine comes to power, and he realizes, he only discovered this, that the vast majority of his army is basically soldiers that happen to be Christian. They are secretly Christian. And he figured, okay, I have a choice here to make. It's either that I continue the same policy of persecuting Christians, in which case I will murder the vast majority of my army, or convert to Christianity. And so he converts to Christianity for very pragmatic reasons, okay? And the Roman Empire continued the same tactics and the same policies of persecution even after Constantine converted to Christianity. Why? Because if you remember the story of the Council of Nicaea, he brings the leaders of all the Christian sects, and he forces them to generate some type of a unified Christian doctrine. And he puts them all together in the same room, and he says, I'm going to give you 3 days. If you don't agree, I will slaughter every single last one of you. And then I'm going to get more leaders, and I'm going to put them in the same room. I'll ask them to do the same thing. If they don't agree, I will slaughter them. And I'm going to keep doing this until you guys come up with a unified Christian theology, because this is a big mess. I can't accept this. I thought that by converting to Christianity, I will unify the Christian soldiers in the empire. I realized that they're all divided within themselves into all kinds of sects. One group that saw Jesus as a human being, flesh and blood, the prophet of God. Other people thought that Jesus is an angel that walked the earth, in the form of man. Some people thought that Jesus was God's own son. He loved him so much, sent him die on the cross. Some people thought that Jesus was God himself. Right? All kinds of ideas. And so these poor priests, when they came together in the room, they had no choice. They had to come up with but this was like jury duty, like the jury have to be unanimous, right? But the only difference is that in jury duty, it's either guilty or not guilty. With these guys, there were like 7 different choices. What are we going to do? So they had no choice but to put it all together. You guys think that Jesus is God himself? Sure. You think that Jesus is the Son of God? Absolutely, no problem. You think that Jesus is an angel, the Holy Spirit? Absolutely. Don't worry about it at all. You think that Jesus is a human being that walks the earth? Will include that as well. Anyone else? And they really put this whole thing together, and they came back to Constantine and said, hey, this is the unified Christian theology. He looked at it, he's like, are you sure? Because this looks like we're talking about three people here, not one. He says, no, 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 no. Just don't say that, please. Okay, this is mainstream Christianity right here. Everyone else that disagreed with the decision at that meeting was persecuted. Every other Christian sect that did not accept this was persecuted. Again, everyone was forced, everyone was pressured, was coerced basically to accept some type of a unified Christian theology. You hear stories about, when the Prophet ﷺ, remember the story, when he sent a messenger to Al-Muqawqis, the Byzantine governor of Egypt, he says, أسلم تسلم وإن لم تسلم فإن عليك ذنب الأريسيين. Convert to Islam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give you peace. And if you don't, then you will carry the sin of the persecution of the Aryans forever. Why? Because of a significant majority of Egyptian Christians did not follow what eventually became Catholicism. They did not follow that. They remained followers of Arius, the Christian priest that was the founder of Arian Christianity. It's defunct now. It's completely disappeared, right? Because they were severely persecuted. Okay, the Nestorians in Iraq, another Christian sect that disappeared over time. So you would think that because Protestant Christianity is an offshoot of Catholicism, that Christianity had no divisions before. That is incorrect. It's just what eventually evolved. Of course, they only called it Catholicism, after Martin Luther. Before Martin Luther, it was just called what? Christianity, right? There was a necessity now to give it a label because a significant majority, no, I shouldn't say majority, a significant number of people followed Martin Luther, especially in Western Europe. So it became now important to define what is the Eastern Church and the Western Church and the offshoot of the Western Church that became Protestant Christianity and so forth. So he started giving it labels. But even prior to that, Christianity was divided, and there was a lot of persecution to smaller groups that were forced, basically. All of that, over time, showed us that it does not work. It doesn't work, right? Maybe it achieves some type of short-term peace. But religion never takes hold in the hearts when it was forced. You will always know that it was forced, okay? Of all the different groups in America today, okay, which group is converting to Islam, very rapidly? No, ethnically speaking. Say again? Hispanics, right? Now, today, Hispanics are converting to Islam at very, very high rates, okay? What is the main reason that is making Hispanics, kind of go back and search for Islam? Where do Hispanics come from, for the most part? They come from South America, right? They come from, I'm not talking about the historical roots. I'm just talking about, where most of them who come to America, they are, they come from Latin America, they come from South America, and so on and so forth, right? Who discovered South America? It was the Spaniards, okay? But who, the majority of their sailors, the majority of their navigators, the majority of their scholars, the majority of their scientists, the majority of their soldiers, what were they? They were Muslim. They were Muslim, but they had to hide their identity. Think about the history, right? When Isabella, started the Inquisition, literally she put the sword on the necks of the Muslims, and the Jews, by the way, in Spain, and it was right at that same time that Columbus was crossing the Atlantic. Right? So we're not 100% sure, like we don't have accurate historical records of all of that, but I think if we were to do historiography, if we were to kind of theorize about history, I think it is more than likely that Columbus's top navigators and top soldiers and so forth were Muslim or had great familiarity with Islam. I actually heard it from a lot of Latino people that come to Islam that For them, they feel that they're just going back to who they were or who they were supposed to be. Okay? If you take a look at African Americans, in the United States, estimates is that between 30 to 50% of African slaves that came to this country were Muslim. Okay? And so, I mean, some of these guys, they're like, wait a second. Why am I all gung-ho about my church and going and, singing hallelujah and doing like speaking in tongues at my Southern Pentecostal church, when all of this was imposed on me by the white colonialists that brought my ancestors here without their choice? Like, there's that sort of like self-discovery that has been happening in America, and a lot of these people are going back to Islam because they are starting to realize that Islam was their natural state. Okay? And so again, coercion does not work. Over time, the grip loosens no matter what. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala teaches us that in the Quran. Okay? With the paradigm of la ikraha fi din, there is no compulsion in religion. And it says la ikraha fi din, there is no compulsion in religion, two different senses. In the sense that it's a bad thing to do. In other words, don't coerce people to follow any religion. But also in the sense that it is philosophically unsound. It doesn't work. It's not something that can be retained. You may try, but over time, because that faith did not take hold in the hearts, it eventually fades. So essentially what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala instituted here was the essentials of a free society. A society where there is free exchange of ideas, where people adopt faith on their own. قَدْ تَبَيَّنَ الرُّشْدُ مِنَ الْغَيِّ. Right? Righteousness is very obvious, and unrighteous is very obvious. If people, when let to investigate this on their own, they will discover it. There is no need to force anyone. There is no need to coerce anyone. The word I think that is used today is religious tolerance, right? Religious tolerance. But the word tolerance is loaded with negativity. Right? The word tolerance means that I hate your guts, I don't want to see your face, but I'm just going to tolerate your existence because otherwise I don't want to go to jail. That's not our spirit. Like, we don't practice religious tolerance, right? We celebrate diversity in the Muslim world, right? Of course, there are places where, there are violations that take place. I mean, my grandfather was an imam. And, I remember, growing up, I would go to his house, and their neighbor, literally across from their apartment, was a priest at the Orthodox Church, the Egyptian Orthodox Church, which is very conservative compared to any church that you've seen. And they were very, very close. And my mom and the priest's daughters were very close, and they were exchanged food and greetings and holidays and stuff like that. This is not religious tolerance. This is acceptance of la ikraha fi din. This is us practicing our religious obligations to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is us knowing that free will is God's gift to humanity. And no human being has the right to strip that away from anybody else. Right? That is essential, I think, for all of us, And if that was not the case, there would be no non-Muslims in the Muslim world today, would they? Right? In Egypt, I think about 15% of the population, is Christian. There is still Jews in Iran. There are still Jews in Morocco. There are still Jews in Yemen, right? It is only, I think, in the post-colonial era, the legacy of Western colonialism, that Muslims are becoming increasingly intolerant of minorities. Why? Because Islam teaches so? No. Because keeping those populations divided serves the purposes of the colonial powers. That is the whole point, divide and conquer, right? So again, this is how essential it is for us to understand la ikraha fi din, or there is no compulsion in religion. But I said that la ikraha fi din establishes the platform of a free society where there is a free exchange and free dialogue and free conversation about certain ideas. So it also essentially regulates the way we interact with other people and the way we talk about faith. So the point here is not that we should refrain from talking to others about faith and about God. Remember in Al Imran, the Prophet, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala teaches us, the story of the Christians of Najran, when they came to Medina, and the Prophet ﷺ hosted them in the mosque, and they literally slept in the mosque, and they ate in the mosque, and they prayed their Christian prayer in the masjid, al-Masjid al-Nabawi. And they had this incredible free exchange of ideas in the masjid, and they felt safe to talk about their Christian faith. And the Prophet ﷺ, presented Islam to them, and at the end of the day, they agreed to disagree, and the Christians went back safely to the southern parts of Arabia, right? And so that, if we say that there is no compulsion in religion, establishes the intellectual foundations of a free society, part of that is the ability to have a free exchange, a respectful, civilized exchange about ideas. So the ayat here, tell us about a dialogue that took place between Ibrahim alayhi salam, and this is ayah 258. It's a dialogue that took place between Ibrahim alayhi salam and what is dubbed in the ayah or mentioned in the ayah as someone atahu Allahu al-mulk, someone that was given a great dominion by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In many, again, sometimes like I always say, and I don't mean that in a critical sense, but classical commentators, I think, because they lived in established Muslim societies and there was intellectual luxury, is the word that I wanted to use. 400 or 500 years after the Prophet ﷺ, they lived a good life, right? Some political turmoil obviously here and there, okay, but there was wealth, there was power. They were superior to all the other civilizations on earth, so they had the luxury. Who is this guy that God talks about in ayah 258? And they go like at length trying to know who this king is, which in my personal opinion is completely irrelevant, by the way, to the story. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala drops names deliberately. Sometimes He mentions the names and sometimes He doesn't, for a reason. I don't think that we should really waste so much time knowing who Dhul Qarnayn is and who this king is. Doesn't matter, okay? But I will, in the interest of just being honest, I will share with you what some of the scholars have said. So the majority of the scholars actually say that this is a reference to An-Namrud, right? The Nimrod, who was the king of the Babylonians. This is the same king that was accused of, catapulting Ibrahim alayhi salam into the fire, right? You remember that story. And so most of the scholars of tafsir, they say that it was the Nimrod, and that the disagreement is whether this conversation took place before the fire or after the fire, which again continues to be completely irrelevant in my personal opinion. And actually, like, I read articles and I read essays that would spend so much time on the identity of the king and very little time on the conversation itself, okay? Which again, in those times when Muslims are kind of established, they're free, they have the luxury to talk about these things, it's fine, okay? But I think in today's age, more than the identity of the king, it matters a lot for us, the essence of that conversation that took place between him and Ibrahim alayhi salam, okay? Some scholars, because it doesn't even mention that it was, the Nimrod, the king of Babylon, some scholars say that it may not even be a king, because it says, Atahu Allahu al-mulk. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given him, great power. It could be like an extremely powerful man, could be an extremely wealthy man. It doesn't necessarily have to be a king. But what we know is that there is a conversation that took place between this man and Ibrahim alayhi salam. And Ibrahim says to him, Rabbi alladhi yuhyi wa yumit. My Lord is the one that grants life and deals death. My Lord is the one that grants life and deals death. So imagine yourself, talking to an atheist, okay? And then, basically you're telling that atheist, that God exists. And the atheist is telling you, why do you think that God exists? Prove it. Prove that God exists. So you say, well, there are things on earth that are alive and things that are dead, okay? God is the one that gives life to the things that are alive, and God is the one that deals death to the things that are dead, okay? It's only God. So this man responds and he says, Ana uhyi wa umit. So actually what he did is that he brought two prisoners, like death row prisoners that were scheduled for execution. And he brought them inside to the court and he says, you go home. And then he executed the other one. And he looked at Ibrahim alayhi salam and says, look, see, Ana uhyi wa umit. I grant life and I deal death, just like your God. Okay? Now, it's funny because there's a massive logical fallacy with this presentation when you think about it. I mean, if Aristotle was watching this, he would have had a heart attack. Right? Because if you've studied formal logic, okay, there is essential causes and then there's conditional causes. Right? We're not talking about conditional causes here. Like if this masjid was empty and then there is a chair, you would say the cause of this chair is Brother Seamus or one of the volunteers, one of the staff members put it here. This chair is here because one of our staff members put it here. That is a cause, right? But it's a conditional cause. What is the essential cause of the chair? Is the plastic molecules of the chair and where they came from. We're trying to get to the actual bottom of what caused the chair to come to existence. Okay, so what the king, quote unquote, did here was he confused conditional causality with essential causality, and he said, you know, it's interesting because I mean he's right in a way that the prisoner that he executed was alive and then now he's dead, so he dealt death. Okay. But the prisoner that he let go was not dead and he gave him life, right? If that prisoner was dead and then he used like hocus pocus on him and then, you know, he came to life, then okay, maybe we can talk about it. But he wasn't dead and you let him go. You know, that has not really changed anything. Again, so he was just using semantics. He was using, just playing with words. But Ibrahim alayhi salam, not only that he did not study formal logic, I don't think he did, right? I also feel like Ibrahim did not want to waste his time. So he jumps into a more obtrusive, a more blatant, you know, a relationship of causality that just simply cannot be denied. And he says, well, okay, you know, what you're saying is wrong, but I'm not going to address it, okay? How about this one? You know, my Lord is the one that causes the sun to rise from the east. Can you cause the sun to rise from the west? If you have that power, like you say, then go ahead, right? فَبُهِتَ الَّذِي كَفَرَ. That's when he's like, you know, he shut up, he didn't know what to say, okay? This is, again, teaches us really, really important things. You know, again, it teaches us the civility of dialogue. It teaches us that people are entitled to their opinions, okay? It teaches us, you know, about causality, and usually causality, or what we today call the cosmological argument for God, whatever, you know, I've personally done a lot of research on this stuff, you know, you could imagine why, is I think one of the most essential arguments that establish the necessity of a creator. Because like I said, if we look for the essential causality of every contingent object, you have to ultimately go back to an original cause, okay? That's a powerful argument. And to this day, by the way, this argument for God cannot be refuted. It sustained some injuries, you know, over the centuries. You know, one of the sisters, I think last time, talked about, you know, A time and B time and all that, and these, you know, kind of semantic theories about time. David Hume, you know, questioned causality in the first place, and he says that, you know, just the fact that every life event and every experience we've had a cause doesn't mean that a time will not come when something happens without a cause. Again, it sounds stupid to you, but it's not something that philosophers can easily dismiss, so they have to address it, all right? So, but again, aside from, you know, some attempts here and there, or Bertrand Russell, who basically says it's futile to try to understand the causality of the universe, it just is. How can we just accept that the universe just is when it's been around for only 13.8 billion years? If it's been around, you know, beginninglessly, then we'd be stuck as people of faith. Who needs God if the universe has always been around? But if the universe is a contingent event and it came to existence, then it's just inescapable to ask who caused that original event. And the one that caused the original event has to be immaterial, has to be timeless, right? Has to be personal, the personal God. And has to be someone that is not part of that universe, right? So causality is important. But I actually think that one of the greatest lessons I learned here is that it was not Ibrahim that started that conversation. It says, أَلَمْ تَرَ إِلَى الَّذِي حَاجَّ إِبْرَاهِيمَ. He's the one that asked Ibrahim for the debate. It was not Ibrahim alayhi salam that started. Okay? And that's what I always say. Do not start debates with the atheists. Do not start debates with the Christians. Do not say stuff that will insult people and just get under their skin and get the worst of them. There's no need to do this. You live Islam to the best of your ability. Live it in your own self, with your own family, at work, and be as clear about your identity as possible. All right? Be like overtly Muslim. Hide nothing about who you are. But I think that is the extent of it. However, you should always be ready with answers when they come and engage you. You don't walk away from it. If it was forced upon you, then you have to engage. But don't initiate it. Ibrahim alayhi salam is just kind of doing his thing, and he's the one that came, hey, by the way, you say that God this and your God is that. And that's when Ibrahim alayhi salam had to kind of respond to that. So I think that really is a great lesson, and it jibes in with the prophetic guidance, إني زعيم ببيت في ربض الجنة لمن ترك الجدال ولو كان محقا. I promise a beautiful house, a beautiful abode in the most prestigious part of Jannah for one who avoids argumentation and contention and debates, even if they think they're right. Because sometimes that's the reason. But I know I'm right. I need to convince them. Right? They're stupid. I have to do something about it. No, that's not your job. But you need to be there and available if, in the event that they ask questions. But having the right set of ideas in order to build a God-centric civilization is not complete without understanding that there are also laws of the universe. Very, very clear laws that don't bend for anyone. And again, remember I said, this is about having the right set of ideas. Without the right set of ideas, you can't conduct your affairs. You will always struggle, okay? As-sunan al-kawniyya, this is what our scholars, basically call it. Universal laws. Universal laws, and I don't mean it like in the sense of physics, like, the cosmological constants or whatever, right? I mean universal laws, and I'm going to give you some examples. Laws that civilizations rise and fall. There is no civilization lasts forever, okay? And there is no civilization that remains under forever. Number two, the righteous may suffer. Number three, the unrighteous may prevail, right? I mean, one of the reasons why people struggle so much, right, is that they think that because they're righteous, nothing bad should happen to them. But something bad always happens to them. And then they're like, what kind of God would do this? And then they lose their faith. But if you know essentially that this dunya is a place of struggle anyway, and that it's very possible, not just possible, it's actually quite likely, that the righteous will suffer, and it is also just as likely that some unrighteous will prevail and will have the upper hand. As-sunan al-kawniyya. These are universal laws, okay? The sooner you accept them, the easier things are going to be for you, right? Number four, change takes time. Change takes time. And if you know that change takes time, then you're not going to be rushing things. You're not going to be concerned. You may even believe that I need to put the seed. It may even happen after I die. It doesn't matter. I'll still try. I'll still put my best, right? And finally, nothing stays the same. The only thing that is immutable, the only thing that is unchangeable is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Everything else in the universe is in constant flux, is in constant change, is in constant transformation, okay? Hence, the story of Uzair, radiallahu anhu. And I want to talk about Uzair, inshallah ta'ala. This is 259. I want to talk about this story because this is an important story that helps us, again, generate the right set of ideas. Ideas that are important for us to deal with our own challenges, our own pain. Ideas that will help us, manage our own families. Ideas that will help us as Muslim ummah and community to attempt at least to build a God-centric civilization in the world around us. So the story of Uzair or Ezra in the Torah, right? Ezra is this very revered, respected figure in the Jewish tradition. Some say he was a prophet. We're not sure. We've had, different views about this in our own Islamic tradition. But I want to give you the background story first, right? So I said earlier that one of the laws of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the universe is that nothing stays the same. There's constant change and constant flux. And there's an ayah in the Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that clearly, وَتِلْكَ الْأَيَّامُ نُدَاوِلُهَا بَيْنَ النَّاسِ. The days are apportioned among people. Some days are days of fortune. Some days are days of misfortune. The days of fortune and misfortune are divided between people. Sometimes you're in a good state, sometimes you struggle. That's a law of the universe, right? And so, remember the dua of Sulaiman alayhi salam. What did he say to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? رَبِّ هَبْ لِي مُلْكًا لَا يَنْبَغِي لِأَحَدٍ مِّن بَعْدِي. Lord, grant me a dominion that will never occur to anyone after me. The greatest dominion that any human being had ever seen on this earth. Okay? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala granted him. It's just absolutely incredible. All the animals and all the different species were working with him, and soldiers in his army. He understood the languages and stuff like that. He had the jinn, build him like the magic carpet, all kinds of crazy stuff, right? But what happened to the Hebrew civilization after Sulaiman alayhi salam? Infighting, internal strife, civil war, all kinds of issues, okay? Who was watching all of this? The Persians. The Persians were watching this. They've always coveted the city of Jerusalem. They always hated the Jews for their success. They always hated them for their godliness, for their great kings, for their connection. I mean, who else could claim that, our king is both prophet and God, right? And so many Persians hated that. And they were waiting for the right chance in order to obliterate the city of Jerusalem, which at the time was the absolute jewel of the world, right? It was the seat of knowledge, the seat of godliness, right? The seat of greatness. It had all the great libraries and all the great temples and so forth. So a few hundred years after, Sulaiman alayhi salam, the situation in Israel, in Jerusalem, became dire. And it became ripe now for a Persian invasion. So the king of the Persians, the Arabs call him Nebuchadnezzar, in the Bible, Nebuchadnezzar. King Nebuchadnezzar of the Persians, he decides to invade Jerusalem with a mighty army, unseen before. He's not interested in the annexation of Israel into his empire. He's not interested in collecting homage from the Jews. He's not interested in their loyalty. He's interested in one thing, and that is to lay waste to Jerusalem. That's it. I want this to be over with. I want it to be done. I think it took him a couple of weeks. Leveled the city completely. Hundreds of thousands of its inhabitants were murdered. And history says that on his way back to Persia, King Nebuchadnezzar had with him over 55,000 Jewish slaves, men, women, and children. A complete, utter displacement of the Jewish people actually took place. There was very, very few left. Some of them fled south, some of them fled north, and the rest were either murdered or captured by the Persians. Very little is actually left in Palestine proper. Now, Uzair is a descendant of the Jewish people in Persian diaspora. Does that make sense? He's a descendant of the Jewish people in Persian diaspora. Things after Nebuchadnezzar got slightly better. I mean, when I say slightly better, they were still enslaved, but instead of working 20 hours a day, they were working 15 hours a day. Okay, things got slightly better for the Jews, in Persia. And then, generations later, Ezra or Uzair, came about. A great pundit, a great scholar, very humble, walking this fine line, walking on eggshells, trying to be true to his faith, but he's trying not to anger the Persian master, right? But there was something about him that also made him very, very unique. Nebuchadnezzar was not interested only in the destruction of the state of Israel and Jerusalem. He also wanted to completely obliterate the Torah. He did not want any of its copies to be available. So he murdered all anyone that had a copy of the Torah was murdered, and the copy was burnt. Now, in some Muslim sources, and I cannot fully verify this statement, but in some Muslim sources they say that there's 4 people that memorized the Torah. Now, we don't know of anyone that memorized the Bible, the New Testament. We know that there are tens of millions of Muslims that memorized the Quran. Okay? But when it came to the Torah, they say that only 4 people memorized the Torah. It was Musa alayhi salam, it was Joshua, Yusha, it was Dawood alayhi salam, and not Sulaiman, and then it was Uzair. They say Uzair was one of 4 that actually memorized the Torah. He was so important for the Jewish community in diaspora because literally he's the last surviving copy of the Torah. They always came back to him for guidance. So I mean, think of it this way. Bits and pieces of the scrolls that were still left, some in this house, a page in that house. Uzair is the one that put the effort to actually memorize it, and he was the one that had it. Again, we're not, I'm not 100% sure about the source here, but this is what we read in some Muslim sources. And so, this is hundreds of years after Nebuchadnezzar. Now, this Jewish community, much like the Hebrews in Egypt, they completely lost the desire to be free. They completely accepted, slavery. You see this, sort of like interesting turn of events. So, they're enslaved in Egypt, and they are liberated by Musa alayhi salam. They rise in Jerusalem. They build this incredible godly civilization, and then they decline again, and they become slaves again, like a 360 turn of events. Okay, civilizations rise and fall. وَتِلْكَ الْأَيَّامُ نُدَاوِلُهَا بَيْنَ النَّاسِ. The days will always turn between men. Nothing stays the same, right? It's a great lessons that you have to understand. But Uzair, basically, his heart is always connected with Jerusalem. He always wants to go back. And he keeps mentioning this, and people just keep calling him crazy. We can't do that, right? If the Persians even smell like a whiff of your attempt to be a runaway slave, they're gonna capture you and murder you. All right? But ultimately, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that's where some Muslim scholars say that Uzair was indeed a prophet of God, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala inspired him to still go to Jerusalem. And he doesn't exactly understand his mission. So, in accordance to the story, it says that Uzair, in the middle of the night, again, kind of like the Exodus, it's only just an exodus of one man this time, right? So in the middle of the night, Uzair basically leaves Persia and he travels all the way to Jerusalem to see this place that is absolutely level. Now it looks like a forest. Okay, there's no sign of human life, nothing, no sign of civilization, just trees and creeks and rivers and stuff like that. Nothing is there. Right? So he has his donkey with him, and he arrives, in Jerusalem, and he's absolutely stunned by the sheer obliteration of a city that lasted for hundreds of years. And he's looking at this, and of course, before the Hebrews, there were other civilizations as well, right? The Philistines and Canaanites or whatever before them. And so he gazes upon the city in utter disbelief. And he says what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala eternalized here in this ayah, أَنَّ يُحْيِي هَذِهِ اللَّهُ بَعْدَ مَوْتِهَا. How could it ever be possible that God would bring this city back to life? This dead city, this dead civilization, this obliterated memory, nothing is left. God, why is he sending me here? What am I supposed to do? What could I possibly do? I am just one man, right? And there continues the story that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala caused Uzair to basically take a slumber in a cave in the mountain. I mean, there's, Some Muslim commentators actually say that Uzair wanted to make himself feel good, so he gathered some tree logs and stuff like that, and he built a small shack in Jerusalem, or what used to be Jerusalem. And he built a small shack, and then, he was taking a tour, trying to see where to start, what to do. There's no sign of human life, nothing. And then he goes up the mountain and he looks upon the city and he says with despair, how could God possibly bring the city back to life? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala caused him to take a slumber. As you know the story, he goes into the cave and he sleeps for 100 years. Okay? And then he wakes up. And as he woke up, he realizes that his food is still intact, it did not go bad. But the donkey is now a pile of unrecognizable rubble, basically. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala shows him, how he puts the bones together and the tissues and the veins and the arteries and the fat and the skin and the muscles and everything. And he saw the donkey being resurrected right before his own eyes, right? وَانظُرْ إِلَى حِمَارِكَ وَلِنَجْعَلَكَ آيَةً لِلنَّاسِ. Look at your donkey as we reassemble it, and we're going to make you into a sign unto men. And it was at that moment that Uzair realized his mission was not to rebuild Jerusalem. His mission was to be the sign that inspires other people to build Jerusalem. He comes out of the cave and he gazes upon the city and he realizes that there are houses and there's livestock and there are little kids walking the streets and there's chimneys with smoke coming out of them. There is life. That's not how he left it 100 years ago. There is now life in the city. Turns out that news spread that Uzair, kind of absconded. He left in the middle of the night, and other people were inspired by the same idea, so they left, and they came to Jerusalem as well. And now there's hundreds of families that are there. They're scattered. They're not strong. They're not powerful, but there is life. They're building their homes, and now they're married, and there's kids and grandkids. It's just only 100 years, right? So he goes back into the city with a completely different spirit. And he starts talking to people. Do you guys know who I am? I am Al-Uzair. He says, there's no way. What are you talking about? It's much like the story of the sleepers of the cave, right? So he's like, you don't know who I am? I'm Uzair. He says, Uzair is the only one that memorized the Torah. So we're going to take you to one of our rabbis who knows a few pages of the Torah. Remember, there's no complete copy of the Torah at this point. He knows a few pages of the Torah. If you pass the test, maybe we'll believe you, because the Torah has disappeared from the world. So he goes to this person, and he recites a few pages of the Torah, and the man is in utter disbelief. They accepted that he is Uzair. And by the way, in another location in the Quran, وَقَالَتِ النَّصَارَى الْمَسِيحُ ابْنُ اللَّهِ وَقَالَتِ الْيَهُودُ الْعُزَيْرُ ابْنُ اللَّهِ. So most Christians say that Jesus, the son of Mary, is the son of God. And some Jews also say that Uzair is the son of God. I actually looked this up in order to verify whether there is a Jewish sect that actually takes Uzair as the son of God. And there are no Western or Eastern Jews, or any, at least not on historical record, that there's any particular Jewish sect that takes Uzair as the son of God. But I discovered something, that there were some Jews in Medina, some Arab Jews at the Prophet's time, that actually almost assumed that Al-Uzair was the son of God because he was resurrected and so on and so forth. So there's an interesting narrative behind all of that. So now the city of Jerusalem was jolted back to life. Now people saw this incredible man, from a different age, who was still alive around them. He's still young. He's still in his 40s, right? They could not believe it, and they took that as a sign of God. Jolted everyone into action, and everyone is now like at work rebuilding not only the city of civilization, but the civilization of the Hebrews themselves, right? But Uzair misses home. And it's interesting that home is now Persia and not Jerusalem. That's where he left his wife and his kids and his family. He wants to go back in order to see how they were. So he travels back to Persia, and he realizes, obviously, that everyone he knew was dead. All of his family members were dead. Every friend that he ever had was dead. Every person that he had ever known is gone, okay? However, he asked them, if there are people here like millennials, people who have passed 100 years, please take me to them. I would like to talk to them. So they take him to a few people, he doesn't recognize them. Until they took him to this very old woman, 110 years of age or 115 years of age, and her name is Ashtar. She used to be his servant when she was a little girl. Now she's 115 years of age. And he goes to her. She's blind. And she's extremely old and frail. And Uzair goes to her and he's in tears. And he says to her, I am Uzair. She recognizes his voice. She tells him Uzair is a man of God. When he prays, God always answered his prayers. Pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to restore my eyesight. And Uzair prayed for her and she restored her eyesight right then and there. And people say that it was that event that basically convinced so many of the Jews in diaspora, to make their way back to Jerusalem in what history called the second Exodus. A lot of people know the first Exodus from Egypt, but they don't know about the second Exodus from Persia, right? And, for a while, the Hebrew civilization was restored, but then again obliterated later by the Romans. There is, inshallah, we will conclude in a few minutes here, and I'll take some questions, but there's a few incredible lessons here that I think we gather. This, I think, is a message to us. It's a message to us, okay? When you, as a Muslim, you just so happen to live in this era of ours, you happen to live, year 2024, okay? I was reading, about the history of the Andalus, of Muslims in Spain. And I read about one of their great kings. His name is Abdurrahman al-Nasir. He's a descendant of, the eagle of Quraysh, Abdurrahman al-Dakhil, the Umayyads that founded the dynasty in Spain. So he was one of his descendants. I think is like 3 or 4 generations after Abdurrahman. So this is Abdurrahman II, I think is what they call him, Abdurrahman al-Nasir II. He ruled Muslims in Spain for 55 years. Brought unprecedented prosperity. Brought unprecedented wealth. Brought unprecedented, beauty in architecture, in urban planning, in highways and beautiful buildings. Absolutely beautiful mosques still standing to this day. Muslims, Jews, and Christians worked in unison. Massive libraries, the production of books, farmland. Spain was feeding half of Europe at the time. Okay, European nobles would send their kids to Muslim Spain, much like people from all over the world send their kids to Harvard and Stanford. If you want good education, you go to Muslim Spain. And I thought about this. Imagine that you were born in Spain, under the reign of Abdurrahman. Your life would have been completely different, right? Completely different existence. You are a superpower. You are unchallenged. You are likely very, very wealthy. There's no poverty over there. There's no one to receive zakah, right? There's clean streets. The city of Cordoba, had public lighting posts that were maintained by the Baladiyah, right? The Turks, they call it the Baladiyah, which is like the municipality, right? The municipality. 850 years before the city of Paris. Almost nearly a millennium before Paris. If you lived in Cordoba at that time, you would feel that you are on top of the world, right? But you were not born in Cordoba, under the reign of Abdurrahman. You were born in Egypt, you were born in Iraq, you were born in Tunis, you were born in Pakistan, right? You were born in Algeria. We're born in everywhere. We're here now. And we know in our heart of hearts that the way things are in the world today, with how Islam is looked at, and how Western superpowers are on top, and how Muslims are being oppressed, and how Gaza is, that was not the case a few hundred years ago. And it certainly won't be the case a few hundred years from today. In fact, the continuation of this era, whether it takes longer or shorter, is entirely up to us. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala left it in our hands. He already gave you the tools. He already gave you the resources. It's like the story of Dhul Qarnayn. Remember when I was talking about it in the khutbah today? Dhul Qarnayn and the third group of people. What did he do? He just provided them with leadership. You guys already possess everything that you need in order to overcome your challenges. You want this difficult era for the ummah to last another 700 years? Yeah, then continue your inaction. Continue with your complacency. But you want this to change, then jolt yourselves into action and realize that we can make it shorter. We can make it 50, we can make it 75 years, we can make it less. With the grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if we put the effort. I was reading recently about how the Harun al-Rashid, everyone keeps reading about Harun, the Khalifa of the Abbasis, right? What people don't know is that it was not him that was in line for the Khilafah. It was his older brother. And the only difference is that they're Persian mothered, because again, most Abbasi Khulafa, they would have an Arab father, the Khalifa himself, and the mother would be of Persian descent. Their Persian mother, right, actually poisoned her older son, because her older son refused to allow her to participate in the affairs of government. Right? Of course. And so he came to power, and he was not supposed to be in power. Okay? His two sons, Al-Amin wal-Ma'mun, they had this civil war. All right? Sometimes what happens is that you may attempt to try and change society from the bottom up and so forth, but just as effective, if not more effective, people run for political office and they achieve massive power. And what could have taken 75 years could actually take 5 years. Who gets to decide how long change actually takes? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells you that change will happen. Okay? How soon or how late, that is entirely up to you. Hence, we go back to the very essence of Surat al-Baqarah, that building a good, beautiful world is a shared responsibility. Allah gave you the marching orders, but it is up to you to use them and how to use them, right? That is one thing I learned from the story of Uzayr. The other thing I learned, again, is that nothing stays the same. And so we continue to see, for example, today the oppression of the Israelis, against the Palestinians. We continue to see the oppression of the Hindutva state against the Muslims in India. We continue to see the oppression of the communist China against 3 or 4 million Muslims. And there, in estimates, there's actually close to 40 million Muslims in all of China. We live in an age where this is the type of news that we deal with every single day. But you know what? Nothing stays the same. It all changes. What is at the bottom one day will become on top, and what's on top will one day become at the bottom. And that is a comforting thought. At least I know that my effort, inshallah ta'ala, is not going to go in vain. And I just need to do what I can. Sooner or later it's going to change. Maybe not in my time, but does that even matter? It shouldn't matter. If change happens posthumously, then be it, at least when I stand before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I'll be able to testify that I have done my part. So these are some thoughts that I wanted to share with you. I think there was one last thing here that I may have forgotten to mention. No, I already mentioned it. So inshallah, I'm going to stop here, and next time there is a beautiful story again about Ibrahim alayhi salam. Now this time is a dialogue between him and his Lord about resurrection. So inshallah we will talk about this and a few other things next time, and we will delve into wealth as a foundation of building a godly civilization. So inshallah, I will take some of your questions in 10 minutes, and then we'll pray Salat al-Maghrib together. Yes, please.
Following what you said about Uzair, Uzair, Babel is the capital of Babylonian Empire.
Mm-hmm.
It is not far away from Baghdad.
South, right?
It is
Southeast?
east, yeah.
Southeast.
And Uzair, grave is there. And after the invasion in 2003, there were some Israeli or Jews, American Jews.
Mm.
They took some of the, because in the museum there is an old, this
Like relics and stuff like that.
Torah,
Mm.
and they took them.
From, well, there was a lot of looting that happened in Baghdad after the invasion. Yeah. Mm. SubhanAllah. If it is true that Uzair was buried in, well, Iraq was part of the Persian Empire, right? If he's actually buried there, then it would reinforce what we've been saying about those immigrants when they just, they're still emotionally attached to the old country, but the new country just becomes home. The Prophet ﷺ is from Mecca, yet he is buried in Medina. Uzair's ancestral heritage is from Jerusalem, yet he's buried in the Persian Empire. It's not a surprise to me. Yes?
Yeah, so I thought it was like interesting when this word Uzair, like the donkey is changing, but the food stays the same. So if you have insight, why is that?
I think so the question is, why in the story of Uzair, the donkey was, kind of, dead and completely like rotten and then put back together, versus the food that stayed the same. I think the point here was to contrast. Is to contrast the two, because the two things are mutually exclusive. If he slept for one night, then the donkey's supposed to be alive and the food did not go bad. And if he was dead or asleep for 100 years, then the food would be bad and the donkey would be bad. But they were both not this, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted to show him that contrast, right? It is only up to me. I have the power. I have the power to cause you to sleep for 100 years, and I have the power to cause this to change and cause this not to change, right? This is entirely up to me. Yes.
Just a quick question. What happened to Uzair alayhi salam, that he went to a cave and then he came back 100 years later? And then what happened to the people of the cave, and then he came back, and then they came to the city like multiple generations after? Is there any like a verdict or any point in our theology that it cannot happen again?
That this what?
That this cannot happen again.
You're asking difficult questions there.
There's a reason. I mean, without all, not including the prophetly miracles of Uzair alayhi salam, I'm just saying that it cannot happen again.
I don't know. I don't think that there is any particular determination that it cannot happen again, right? It's at least that was not mentioned. The thing is, does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have the power to cause this to happen again? Obviously. That goes without saying. Will it happen again? That is something that is entirely up to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to answer. The thing is, I think we started developing technology that may actually lead to that. If you put someone in, I don't know if they've done this with warm-blooded creatures yet, but at least with cold-blooded creatures now they do cryo sleep and stuff like that, and you can actually you reduce their biological functions to the bare minimum, and they're still alive, but they're kind of asleep, and it goes on for 50 years. I don't think that we've done that with warm-blooded creatures yet, but when we do discover the technology, I mean, I'm so bored of the world, I'm going to go ahead and sleep for 150 years. You better make sure that there are some surviving people that will continue to take care of your tomb, though.
The reason I asked this
Yeah.
question, does the door of miracles on this earth have closed permanently after the finality of Prophet ﷺ, or it can continue to happen? But he can protect some people, he cannot, if it's up to him. You know.
Miracles as an expression of prophetic might and power definitely have ended. Definitely have ended. Supernatural events, I don't think that I could say that they necessarily ended.
There's
Okay.
something in our theology.
Not particularly. You know, there's in the tradition there is the concept of karama, right? The miraculous things that happen to the righteous sometimes, and so forth. There are all kinds of narrations about this, you know, in history or with the Sahaba and the Tabi'een and so forth. But I feel like ultimately these are events that could be explained scientifically. Like if someone today says that they slept for 200 years, I think we'll be able to find a scientific explanation for that. Well, they've put him like in some time. There's some kind of technology that maybe explains it. So, but I definitely I think we have to concede to the fact that a miracle in its strict religious definition is definitely something that has ended.
The reason I ask this question because the Jewish and the Christianity, their complete faith depends on this absolute, supernatural phenomenon of miracles that were provided by God. Their theology, because that's the question that they ask to us Muslims: that what are your miracles? And we asked to us, there were miracles that were performed in the life of Prophet, but our theology does not depend on that. It
Correct.
depends on the miracle of Quran, that everything around us is a miracle in itself if we continue to believe it, if we think very closely.
Correct.
So that was what I was trying to reconcile.
No, I definitely favor that view. I certainly favor that view. Yeah. It was yes.
No, there's no compulsion in Islam, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's what the ayah says. Can you comment on this idea that if a Muslim leaves a religion, then he has to be dealt with in a way?
Very good question. So the question is, if there is no compulsion in religion, why is it that mainstream Islamic theology indicates that if someone renounces Islam, that person needs to be executed? Is that what you're asking? I've gone back and forth about this notion over the years. Okay, and I think the best conclusion that I've reached is that at some point, maybe in the first few hundred years, when religious faith and political loyalty were synonymous to each other, and renouncing your faith meant that you join the enemy and you start fighting your own people, it actually justified execution, because this would be espionage, collaboration with the enemy in a time of war. Like even in America today, if that happens, that person would be executed. All right? But over time, when religious faith and political loyalty were disengaged, actually the Islamic State over the centuries, this practice was completely stopped. The practice of executing people. And when you think about it, if you follow the fiqh of this, if someone renounced their Islam, they're supposed to understand the laws. They're supposed to know exactly the consequences of that decision. And you're supposed to go talk to them and tell them, you're going to be executed in 3 days. And if they still insisted, that's when you adjudicate the ruling. But again, the conclusion that I've reached is that wasn't necessary at a point, because if someone renounced Islam, they would have joined the enemy and started fighting their own people. Whereas in this age, it would make zero sense for us to say, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave you the full right to accept him or to reject him, but hey, if you accept Islam once, there's no going back. Like that in and of itself doesn't make sense. Okay? And of course, someone might say, okay, what about somebody that if someone converted to Islam, then that person at least, he have every freedom not to convert. But if you convert, then you cannot go back. Very silly argument. I don't personally accept it. But I would respond and say, what about someone that was born to a Muslim family? That person was not given the freedom to convert to Islam in the first place. Why are you preventing them from renouncing their faith if they wanted to? And so it is actually my position that these are not matters that can be dealt with by violence whatsoever. I've seen people who have left Islam. I've seen people who have come back to Islam. And forcing them to stay, I would rather that I know who they are so that I know who I'm dealing with. I don't want you to be hiding your kufr and then you live in my house. I wouldn't want that, right? So that's my response to it. Yes.
The theme of today's talk was the rise and fall of civilizations, and obviously that applies even to Muslim world. That at the time, achieving great things was a superpower. Obviously, Muslim Spain. Which, by the way, Yasser Qadhi is coming out with a new book on Islamic Spain.
Right.
So inshallah, something
Right.
to look forward to.
Mm-hmm.
But so applying to even our own history as well, and this is something that I'm trying to read up more about, including how Salahuddin led to the revival, and the caliphs at that time led to the revival that returned Jerusalem back to Islam as well. And one of the themes that I'm seeing emerging is when a civilization stops generating new ideas or being open to the debate of new ideas as well. And Muhammad Asad talks about it in his Road to Mecca, where he goes to Al-Azhar and they're all repeating the same textbook, and it's just rote memorization and repetition happening. And there's no discussion, there's no debate, there's no regeneration of ideas.
Mm.
And then hence there's no action being taken. So I'm wondering if that is the phase that we need to be entering, or what does that look like, that we have lost the idea generating force within our Muslim ummah? And what does that look like? And perhaps us in the West, with the freedom of religion and the amenities that the West offer us, have that potential to be.
Right. You know, if we go back to the very theme of Surah Al-Baqarah, you know, and I've said this repeatedly, that it's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that grants the marching orders, but then it is now our job to take those orders and execute them. It's the relationship between the general and the field officers and the soldiers. So the general basically says, we need to take the city, okay? Now it's up to the officers to decide, you know, the actual military maneuvers in order to take that city. And then the soldiers on the ground, they have to deal with like day-to-day challenges, and there's a mortar attack coming from here, and then there is that ambush over there. They deal with all of these things. But the objective is to take the city, all right? And so in Islam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, let's say that He says, one of your goals is the establishing of justice. So if you live at you know, the time of the Khulafa, the establishment of justice, you know, in that society would come in the form of, okay, establishing a strong khilafah with a strong, you know, justice system, with a sound, you know, set of laws, and so on and so forth. If you take that paradigm of the khilafah and you try to implement that in Roseville, California in 2024, it won't work. So now you're getting caught up in the trees and you're forgetting the forest. The forest is, I need to establish justice. You take the paradigm and you implement that paradigm today. How do I establish justice right here in this community of ours as a minority Muslim community that lives here? And then I start coming up with Islamic solutions that are fit for our reality. If one of us runs for Congress, and I think I told some of you, you know, that a very close friend of mine is running, you know, for the Michigan 11th district against an incumbent, you know, for Congress. If he wins, I know he's going to come back to me with all kinds of questions. As an American Muslim in the United States House of Representatives, how do you achieve justice? How do you become an advocate for justice while maintaining your faith? How do you defend Palestine? How do you defend free speech? How do you defend fiscal responsibility? How do you defend immigration rights? How do you push back against the prevalence of the LGBTQ culture? How do you push back against atheism while at the same time maintaining a free society, right? How do you find balance when it comes to gun control or, you know, the drugs or whatever it is, all the issues that we deal with, you know, as Americans? As a Muslim, how do you use your faith in order to achieve justice in this milieu, in this reality? That becomes the conversation. And that is why if we don't go through the process of generating new and fresh ideas, not in the sense of bid'ah, right? It's just new ideas to help us implement the very essence of Islam into this reality and keep it relevant. If we don't do that, we die. And I think that the reason the Muslim Ummah was colonized is because the process of generation and regeneration of ideas had stalled. And now it just became a matter of parroting, old textbooks and spewing the same thing that stopped being relevant 500 years ago. And I'm not saying that scholarly works are irrelevant. I'm just saying they were relevant up to a point. And then they need to be supplemented with more and more scholarly works that derive the essence, keep the essence, but again, get innovative when it comes to the applications. And again, none of this would suggest that we will change the structure of the Islamic prayer, or that haram and halal will be adjusted. None of that is going to be touched. In fact, that is the very core of Islam itself. But how you take Islamic ideals and implement them is going to be defined by the challenges of the climate. And that's why I think one of the greatest blessings of us being Muslims in America today is that we have an opportunity to have that free exchange. And maybe that renaissance will come from here. Yeah. Yes.
So, because we were talking about religious tolerance, we should not be doing religious tolerance rather than religious acceptance. Then we think about, our patients or our co-workers, celebrating their religious holidays, and then we're living, within the same culture, and they come to us and say Merry Christmas, for example. By responding to them, are you really affirming their belief system? How do you balance that? Like, you have not affirmed their belief system, but yet you have to be, courteous. Is there a balance there?
Well, obviously, religious tolerance and everything hunky-dory are not the same thing. Religious tolerance and accepting everything as valid, those are two different things. All right, you accept the diversity of the world, but at the same time, you have to go to bed every night feeling comfortable that Islam is the proper path. And if Islam is the proper path, then other paths are crooked, incorrect paths, even if they claim to be godly paths. There has to be clarity in your heart about this. All right, and so when it comes to how to interact with non-Muslims and so forth, we are bound by the Islamic tradition. We're not going to come up with our own ideas. We're not going to come up with our own paradigms. We are bound by the Islamic tradition. And it is the Islamic tradition that taught us, وَإِذَا حُيِّيتُم بِتَحِيَّةٍ فَحَيُّوا بِأَحْسَنَ مِنْهَا أَوْ رُدُّوهَا. When you are greeted, then at least return a better greeting. So return a better greeting, or return the same greeting at least. So if someone, and this is what Sheikh Qaradawi says, if someone greets you in your own holidays, and that person is your neighbor, it is proper for you to greet them in their holidays. And I've made a video about this a few years ago. You still have to be careful though, because when these ideas were produced, Islam had the upper hand. And so when a Muslim greets their non-Muslim neighbor on the occasion of their holiday, it was looked at as the sign of respect and strength and tolerance. But in some context, this may actually look as a sign of weakness and a sign of you trying to integrate and a sign of you, trying to forego your own culture and so forth, and that will only bring, disrespect to you. So you have to be also careful, walking this fine line. I have personally made up my mind about this a long time ago. I don't say Merry Christmas to anyone in general, but I don't personally think it's haram to do that. I would rather say Happy Holidays or something like this. If they greeted us, then we greet them. And that is, conducive to the mutual respect that you are supposed to have with your neighbors, regardless of the faith of those neighbors. And I know that many Muslims would disagree with me on this matter, by the way. Many scholars would disagree with me on this matter. This is such an important thing for them. But again, inspired by what I know from the Quran, in Surah Al-Mumtahina, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لا ينهاكم الله عن الذين لم يقاتلوكم في الدين ولم يخرجوكم من دياركم أن تبروهم وتقسطوا إليهم. If you are dealing with non-Muslims that have not fought you, they have not attempted to displace you and remove you from your home and attack you, then not only that you're supposed to act justly with them, you are supposed to act with great righteousness. Go above and beyond, birr, right? And so, from that particular angle, I would say that that it is not particularly haram to greet people, on the occasion of their holidays.
Also, it depends on your intent. We're not intending to congratulate them with an intention that we affirm their belief. It is more of true.
But here's the thing, it can very easily step into the territory of celebration too. Because some Muslims would say, we live in a non-Muslim society, everyone celebrates Christmas, let's say Merry Christmas to our neighbors, let's say Happy Holidays, let's have a Christmas tree, let's exchange gifts. It can very, very gradually step into the territory where now you're not maintaining good relations anymore. Now you've adopted the holiday itself as your own, and that's when it becomes haram. And so you really have to draw the line somewhere and be very clear. And you have to also understand the impact of what you say, on others. Even if you know your own intentions, will your child understand that intention? Will your grandchild understand that intentions? What could happen to these ideals over time? Will subsequent generations kind of like fully give in, to when you had the best intentions? So there's a lot to consider here, for sure. But,
I was going to add, mention the intent.
yeah, absolutely.
I had one more question.
Yes.
Nobody else had a question?
Well, we need to pray Maghrib very soon, you guys. I think Sister had a question there.
Just on the same subject. Myself, I've been here for over 30 years. I made it a point that I will never say Merry Christmas to anyone. But when I receive it, whether it's in the store or at work or anything, I politely say you as well. I made it a point that I would say Happy Holidays during those times.
Right.
If I'm saying it.
Right.
And by me saying you as well, I'm not even saying thank you or anything, but I'm just returning back their.
Yeah, same to you. Yeah.
And I'm hoping I'm not doing any guna on that. And I've always.
I don't think so.
I'm doing it, but I can't just say me.
I don't think so. I wouldn't think that would be like a guna. Yeah. I think we have to stop here, guys. Inshallah, if you have any other questions, we can always talk after Maghrib. Jazakallah khair. Subhanak Allahumma bihamdik. نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. Inshallah, we're going to pray Maghrib in 3 minutes. Thank you, guys.